you very much for joining me today, Immo. You are well known throughout the entire brewtubing community for your entire earlier contributions to the community, for learning how to brew, all of your tips and techniques, of course the Gruit, and your latest obsession with hot rock brewing. So I hope to be able to get to that soon. But before we get there, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and, where do you come from and how did you get into home brewing?
Okay. Well, I grew up in California, essentially. I was born in another state, spent a little time in Arizona as well, but I spent most of my adult and adolescent life in California. Along the way, I ended up going to college, and when I was in college, we figured that it might be a good idea economically to brew our own beer rather than buy it. I had an economics roommate who, in his infinite wisdom, thought it would be better to spend $200 rather than on beer, but to buy brewing equipment, and that somehow over an extended period of time we would get a better return on the value of our equipment. If we just brewed it ourselves, and in the long run, the cost of each beer would go down, over time as the initial investment paid itself off, and that was mostly true. So my first beer kit was a Mr. Beer kit. It was way back in the day, 94, 95. I brewed this thing, and it basically was a kit that came with a bladder, or brew in a bag, like quite literally, not to be confused with the method of brewing in a bag. And it had like a little flapper kind of valve airlock thing on it, and it really didn't work. It was an absolute disaster. Didn't turn out very good. First one didn't turn out at all. The first one blew up in my closet.
So this bladder thing was like some sort of plastic bag that was liquid malt extract that you just added water to, or what was it?
No, they didn't even think of that. They had a separate bag of malt extract that you had to pour into the bag, or pour into like a boil kettle, and then pour hot water to mix it up, and then pour it into the bag. But that would have been a great idea. They should have just had the bag be big enough that you could put hot water into it to melt it back down. But no, it was worse than that. We had to mix the beer and then put it in this bag, and then the bag was like a pillowcase-sized bag that was not constructed well enough for my closet anyway, and I blew it up, and it was awful. It was, yeah.
Okay, so your very first brewing experience was like
a disaster. It was awful. I did this, like the bag with the malt extract was messy. And, it said to heat up water and mix the stuff together, and I did that. And I remember I was trying to get all the liquid in this stupid little bag, and I didn't have a funnel, and it was just, that the brew day was a disaster, and I didn't know what I was doing. And I was just like, I got this thing for my, for like Christmas, and I was like, oh, cool, Mr. Beer Kit, I'll give it a shot. But I suspect, the Mr. Beer Kit that I had didn't come with bottles or carbonation sugar or anything like that. It just came with like the bag and the malt, and I suspect after having done a couple of those way early on that I didn't get the starter kit. I got like the do it again kit,
So it was nothing about making beer. It was only about making beer, not about packaging beer.
Yeah. It didn't have any bottles or anything, and then I thought, okay, well, we'll just pour it into like a soda pop bottle, and we'll figure it out, And this is 20 years ago, so I mean, it's kind of a little bit fuzzy because we were drinking a lot of beer at the time in college. And
you don't say.
Yeah, but when it first started, when the adventure into brew making started, I started with Mr. Beer Kit, and it actually smelled really good. It smelled kind of like beer, and I'd never had beer that wasn't fermented before. I'd never tasted wort, so I didn't know what it was supposed to taste like. But I put it in my closet. It said put it in a cool, dark place, like such as in a closet or a dark corner or whatnot. And 3 days later, it exploded, and it was all over my clothing, and it was like a horror story. Like I got out of bed and I looked over at my closet, and there was like this like big wet spot that was like invading from the closet into my bedroom. This dark brownish kind of liquid. And I was like, oh no, I knew that bag broke. Like, sure as you can, the day is long. I looked at that thing and I was like, oh no, I know what happened there. And then I opened up the door and it was like, because when I opened up the door to my closet, it was like even worse inside than I had expected. I mean, there was mold, extracty, liquidy goo everywhere. It was on the roof. It was on my clothing. It somebody had gone in and murdered my bag, and it was just nothing but bag guts and goo just all over. Like, it got on my books. It got on my. Unfortunately, it got on my remote control helicopter controller, and that was like a $500 controller down the drain. It was awful, and. It was a disaster. I was like, I am never going to try this again.
So it was like a nightmare from Star Trek, and you were just waiting for the dribbles to come out of the closet and attack you or something.
Exactly. So, immediately after saying, I'm never going to do anything like that again, 3 weeks later, we get another Mr. Beer kit, and we're like, all right, let's give this a shot. That didn't turn out so good. We didn't really figure out the whole bottling thing. Tasted it. It tasted not remotely like beer. Didn't have a very good experience. Didn't have a good experience like putting in the pre-hopped, kit. And this is way before Cooper's purchased Mr. Beer. I think Cooper's purchased Mr. Beer a couple of years ago.
How old were you then? Are we talking like 20, 22?
Like 21. Yeah, 20, somewhere between 20 and 21. My sister, I think, accurately figured out that I was brewing beer before I should have been brewing beer. But I, of course, won't admit to that because I officially started brewing beer around 1994. Okay. And but she's a smart cookie. But I had some friends that lived, a couple dorms away, and they were brewing beer, and they were doing sort of a mini mash kind of a thing because like the kids' dads brewed beer, and we thought, well, hey, let's try this again. And they actually knew what they were doing, and they invited me over for an afternoon, and I watched them do a mini mash. And that was fascinating and way above my skill level at the time. But it kind of reinforced, hey, this can be done. You can do it. Let's just figure it out. And sort of having somebody sort of hold your hand and say, okay, you're doing it all wrong. Here's what you did wrong. You should try this. Here's what we're doing today. Watch and learn. Check out this book. And I was given a book by Dave Miller for homebrewing.
Yes.
And I eventually picked up the John Palmer book. And between the two books, the John Palmer book and the Dave Miller book, I had a really good starting point in a day and age where web crawler was the YouTube, or was the search engine. There was no such thing as Google and YouTube. Yahoo.
So now we're talking about 1994, 1995 time frame.
Somewhere on there. And so I basically read the books and figured out, oh, hey, this is doable. I can learn how to do it. And what I really liked about Palmer's book was that, throughout the book he had said things like, don't worry about it, man's been making beer for 5,000 years, and you can too. And, if you want to learn about the science, here it is in this chapter. But if you don't want to learn about the science, if you just follow these steps, it's still going to work, whether you know how the science works or not. And, and he had like little preludes, like, thank you to my wife and for putting up with all my brewing equipment and my kitchen. And, and it was a very encouraging book. So between the two books, the Miller book and the Palmer book, I figured it out, and it became kind of a hobby that I didn't start brewing thinking, hey, I'm going to do this forever. My roommate, I thought he was crazy because he's like, oh yeah, we could return the cost of our equity over time to make this and you know what, he was right. I could buy a 55-pound bag of grain from the brewery. It cost me something like $30-40. I could make 5 batches of beer. Doesn't cost me anything now that I have all the equipment. But equipment, on the other hand, that's kind of pricey.
Okay, so what beer were you brewing back then, and what led to craft beer?
Well, back then, the only thing that was available to me was the Mr. Beer kits. And then I discovered through my neighbors a couple dorms down that there's like homebrew supply stores, and we had to drive 4 days and 4 nights and cross 16 rivers to get to this place, and we had to face east when we prayed to make sure that anyway, it was always an adventure to go get parts. But I started with pre-hopped kits, and then I discovered extract with where you add your own hops, and then I did that for a while, and I did the natural progression where I pre-hopped, extract, partial, mini mash, all grain, and so on and so forth. And along the way, I figured out how to make good beer out of all of those methods. You really can make good beer from extract. I've got extract. This is going to be my next brew, just because it's simple and it's easy and it's there and it saves time. But you can do it. Any of those methods, and but I started with the pre-hopped kits to kind of work my way into more complex styles of learning the craft. So
what about, where's the dividing line between you brewing your own beer and discovering craft beer? Was there ever a dividing line, or was it just a continuum?
No, there was like when we were drinking with the friends back in the day. There was a lot of Miller and Bud Light, Coors, and Coors Light. My favorite macro American style lager is Coors Banquet, in case anybody wants to know. And I don't really like any of the other ones. But there's a lot of that kind of beer, and I really wasn't terribly interested in drinking American macros, because, quite frankly, I didn't have the palate for it. And it's not to say that American macros are bad beers. I mean, I drink Coors all the time. But back then, it wasn't really something that was screaming, "Hey, drink me more often." And then my best friend at the time came over with like a 6-pack of like random beers. So he had like a Newcastle and a Guinness Stout, and he had a Harps Lager and a Bass Pale Ale and a couple other things, and then he had like a growler of something from the local brewery, and he just sat down and he's like, "Okay, I know you don't really like Budweiser and Miller, and that's all those guys drink over there, but I want to teach you about some beers that I enjoy drinking." And we sat down, and I tried a red and a nut brown and a stout and a porter, and I had a couple different Mexican lagers, and kind of went through, I don't know, I guess it was more than a 6-pack, but you get the idea. We went through over the course of several days trying many different styles of beer, and I was like, oh, hey, beer can really be good. It doesn't have to just be this American macro lager flavor. And about that was the time that we decided that, hey, we wanted to drink beer and enjoy the effects, and but we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, so we couldn't afford good beer. We could only afford Miller. Nobody wants to drink that, or I should say a lot of people wanted to drink that, but none of us really thought the flavor. We thought the flavor could be better having had some other things out there.
Right.
Now, I have an interesting perspective on American macros, because I think there's a lot of homebrewers out there that really don't like Coors, Budweiser, Miller, insert name of American macro, PBR, whatever.
Sure. So what do you think about American macros?
I think that they're actually a very difficult style of beer to brew, and the fact that they're able to take a minimal amount of hops and grains and ingredients and turn it into a profitable product that tastes the same every single time, that is a hell of a brewing accomplishment. I mean, and having gone through a lot of the different flavors of beer and going back to an American-style lager, I actually enjoy it now, whereas way back in the day, I didn't really enjoy those types of beers. They had a little bit too much of a something that I didn't like on my palate. But I drink Coors all the time. That's like my go-to beer when I go out to the bar, because it's cheap, it's affordable, it's everywhere. And if there's something else out there, then I'll drink that too. But I didn't like American-style lagers until after I started brewing and kind of came back to it, so to speak. But they're very unique. This very unique flavor of beer, and as part of the culture, I finally embraced it. Whereas at first I didn't really like it because it didn't have enough flavor or something.
For them, the ability, as you said, to reproduce the same flavor over and over and over again, and not just in one location, but around the world.
world. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a hell of an accomplishment, and they're doing it with a minimum amount of grains and hops, and I mean it's a very efficient style of brewing to maximize your dollar when you're making a product for sale. So, at first I didn't really like that style of beer, but I've become to like it from a financial and economic standpoint. I was like, wow, this is a really cool product, and from the product being part of my culture, in the United States, it's what you drink when you watch football. That's really it took a while, but I came around to it. I think very highly of American lagers, but I'm probably never going to go out of my way to brew one.
So speaking of not going out of your way to brew one, what specifically do you like to brew nowadays?
Well, my favorite style of beer to brew would be ambers, pales, and IPAs. That's just what I do the best. My favorite style of beer to brew now is gruits and hot rock beers. So
That's a very interesting sort of topic because I knew you when you started talking about gruits, and it was the first time I ever was introduced to gruits was by watching your YouTube videos. And it's like, then I went off and I had to go and look up Wikipedia for gruits and tried to discover that. But how did you discover gruits, and how did you come to develop the recipe that you did for your first gruit?
Okay. Well, I was bored with brewing, and just as in some of my, I know I talked about this in one of my previous videos, you kind of go through stages of learn to brew, try and brew the most alcoholic thing ever. Like high gravity beers are very challenging to brew, and they're a learning experience. Anything that you do, I think, can make you a smarter person. So always experiment, try new ingredients, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just in that lull of like, I'm sick of brewing. I've brewed everything, and I'm not being inspired or excited to brew or try something. I want something new. I want something different. And it was at about that point in my life where I happened across a book. It was called something like The Sacred Art of Healing Herbs and Brewing, or something like that. I still have the book. It's in storage. I don't have access to storage. It's 2,000 miles away, but what have you. That was the book that I read through the book, and I was reading to the history of like the Reinheitsgebot, the beer purity law, that beers were, ultimately made from hops, water, and barley because, that's what people wanted to call beer, and they were trying to differentiate it, I understand, from gruits and other styles of brewing. And I think my understanding is that people were tired of paying the tax to the church for gruit ingredients that the church would sell peasants so that they could make their fermented alcoholic beverage with the herbs and spices that were in gruits. And I understand that was partially the cause of the Reinheitsgebot, which is partially the cause of differentiating gruit from beer so the church couldn't tax it. And then it took 50 years to get a beer purity law in place so that people weren't putting in things to have extra kick that could be harmful to the person consuming the beer. And it was really kind of a fascinating, interesting time period. And I was like, well, I want to try this gruit stuff. I don't know anybody who's brewed a gruit. I've never had a gruit. I've never even heard of the style until I started reading about it. I think it might have been referenced in like a, Lord of the Rings book or something at one point, as grog or gruit or what have you. But
Right.
I was like, well, here, I'm going to try and brew something that nobody's brewed. And no matter how it turns out, nobody knows how it's supposed to taste because nobody's ever had one. So let's just do an experiment. So what I did is I kind of wrote down a lot of the ingredients that people had, when I was reading through the history of the style of things that were commonly put into a liquid mixture for flavor or effect or what have you. And I just started writing. I just wrote like this 60 to 80 ingredient list on an 8.5 by 11, and it was just covered with different ingredients and random things. Heather, mugwort, yarrow, chamomile, damiano leaf, Labrador tea, hemlock, eye of toad, like you name it. It was all. I just wrote it down, and I started calling around Colorado looking for like, does anybody have any of this stuff? And I probably called 8 8 places over the course of a couple days. And when I got to like the 8th phone call, the guy said, look, I get this call, occasionally throughout the year. Let me point you to a guy that I know will have some of what you're looking for sure, without a doubt. Now, I'd heard this like 10 times before, and that's how I was talking to this guy. And he said, but it's not like an herbs, it's not like your regular store. It's sort of like, the store that you would go to get stuff for like sacred healing and, parts of religions and the occult and that kind of stuff. I was like, okay. So I finally went to this place.
It's like ingredients that you would discover through like witchcraft.
Yeah, or like the druids and where they're people living in harmony with nature, and there's a hippie element there and an occult element there and an herbalist element there, and it was just kind of like a store that they were selling stuff to people who didn't know where to get the stuff that they were looking for, and that's kind of what they specialized in, was hard to find ingredients. So I went to this place in Denver that was called Herbs and Arts, very interesting store. There's a little bit of culture in it that you walk through the door and, whatever you might be into, they kind of had a little bit to go there. And they had a lot of herbs and ingredients and incense and, books on nature and books on religion and stuff that I didn't even go down some of the aisles. And it was a really, really cool place. A little bit different, like the guy said. And I walked up to the counter and I said, hey, I'm looking for some hard-to-find ingredients. Can you help me? And he says, well, I can't, but my herbalist guy can. Let me get him out of the back room. This guy came out and kind of sat down with me and looked at my list and pulled out this big black Sharpie pen and just started marking stuff off, and here I'm watching my list of, ingredients, unknown although they may be, just getting butchered. He's like, oh, that's a poison. Oh, that would taste terrible. You don't want that. That's illegal. And I've never even heard of this. And, I just watched these, it looked like a CIA spy document when it was done. It was like everything was blacked out. But he had narrowed this list of like 60 to 80 things, probably down to about 20 items. And he had about 12 of them. And then we kind of went into he's like, what are you trying to do with this? And he's like, well, I think that this would complement this herb, and this herb's used in witchcraft for astral travel, and, Damiana leaf is used for this, and it's illegal in Kentucky, because it was used in the, the fake marijuana mixture that people would use to try and get high, and it was one of the ingredients, so now it's illegal, and, and he kind of went through all these little different, ingredients of here's what it's commonly used for, here's what it tastes like, does it have a lemony tinge, an herbal tinge, does it smell nice, and he kind of helped me select, several ingredients that he thought would be good, in a beer-like concoction, and I grabbed those ingredients and I just stabbed it in the dark. Well, give me an ounce of each, let's start from there, kind of a thing. And I took it home and brewed up my first batch of Gruit. I think I called the video my first Gruit. And it was really just a stab in the dark. And everybody that I gave it to, like people like BH Brewing and, DJ the Chef and some of the other guys that are local to Colorado, they tasted it and they had positive feedback for me. And it turned out kind of like an alcoholic Arnold Palmer-ish Long Island iced tea kind of a thing.
What do you mean when you say Arnold Palmer? I mean, what comes to your mind when you say Arnold Palmer? Because I think golfer extraordinaire.
Well, Arnold Palmer had this drink where he mixed half lemonade and half iced tea together.
Okay.
And that was like his favorite drink, so everybody calls that mixture an Arnold Palmer here.
Okay.
So like if you go to the grocery store and you look down the aisle of iced teas, there is a can made by Arizona Iced Tea and everybody else that has called Arnold Palmer.
Okay.
That's the name of the beverage, which is just half iced tea, half lemonade.
Okay.
So I apologize. I understand there's people throughout the world that probably don't know that is the actual name of a drink in the United States. It's called Arnold Palmer.
Okay.
So the Gruit turned out kind of like a tea lemonade-ish kind of a thing. It was really refreshing, and it was delicious, and it was lightly carbonated, and it was even better when I put it on ice cubes, and it was like the really cool summertime refreshing Fermented iced tea, not to be confused with kombucha. Didn't have that bacterial thing going on.
No,
it was just like a fermented, light, drinking, easy, yummy thing.
And it was extremely popular because it wasn't only isolated to around Colorado. I mean, I remember hockey player tried to brew it, and so did a few other players within the brew tubing community, including myself. And we had interesting results.
Yeah, some people brewed it, so they liked it. Some people brewed it, and I think hockey player got infected because he didn't like the way his turned out. And I put the recipe, or at least several of the iterations, when I was actively tracking. I haven't tracked a recipe in years, but this is something that I was interested in, so I wanted to kind of track what I did, so that I could kind of go back and maybe try and recreate the results. So I put that up on brewtubers.com and 17brewtube.com on both of those forums. So if people wanted to go and check it out, I think if you type in Gruit, it'll probably take you to the right thread.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people have tried it, and then there's other people like Steve 45CA. He tried it, but he used Labrador tea, which is something that I couldn't get where I lived. Which is Leadam Pasteurites. Apparently, if you eat too much of it, it'll make you dizzy or something. But there's a lot of those. A lot of people tried different things that I couldn't get. I couldn't find marsh rosemary, and I couldn't find Labrador tea, and I couldn't find something else. And I've tried it, with wormwood. Some people use wormwood as a bittering agent. You can find it at most home brewing supply stores instead of hops. And so I know that a lot of people tried a bunch of stuff and have contributed to that forum. And it's really cool to see a YouTube community, or any community, it doesn't have to be YouTube, kind of put their feedback in when they try something, and they say, oh, it's lemony, or I didn't like it, or it was too bitter, or I tried this and that didn't work, and I tried that and it worked great. Everybody else should try this thing. And that's what I really like about the YouTube community. It's people trying to help other people out and sharing their knowledge.
Absolutely. And that was fantastic. A lot of people had commented that the reaction or the effects of the Gruit was not necessarily what they had gotten from alcohol or beer. They thought that their buzz from the Gruit was a little bit more elevated than the typical beer buzz.
Well, it's very possible. I understand from the herbalist guide that yarrow and mugwort were commonly used in ancient times for astral travel in witchcraft, which basically means you have nice dreams. Chamomile has been known to have a relaxing, calming effect and make it easy to go to sleep, and I use some of that in there. Leadam Pasteuri, or Labrador tea, as it's also known, is also has that sort of thing. Heather, which if used or stored improperly causes a fungus to grow on it that's gives you a mushroom psychedelic thing, which is why it's so regulated when it's sold in the States. It will make sure that the heather is properly stored before it's sold. And a lot of those other things, like Damiano leaf, I understand can get you that sort of a high kind of a feeling. And that's the one that's illegal, I think, in Kentucky, because it was used in the substitute 420 mix or whatever. And so a lot of these things have, I think, some qualities that people would like to inflate or say, oh, if you drink this, you'll get high. And I don't really think that's the case, but I would say that maybe with the chamomile and some of the other things that you add into it, it does make for a pretty calming, nice, sort of sleepy kind of a buzz without, I never felt like I went to different places or anything when I drank it, but the buzz wasn't just like oh, I'm drunk. It was kind of like, oh, I feel pretty nice and relaxed kind of a buzz, like a nice glass of wine or something, and maybe some people put a little bit more of something in there, or, maybe their batch turned out different depending on, how they did things, but I could see that. I think that the Gruit had a really nice relaxing effect to it, is it night and day, or is it like trying to go out and look for, some kind of a body high? I wouldn't say it's quite that.
Yeah. Okay.
But relaxing, I've heard other people say that. I didn't get that effect personally.
So after you talk about brewing a Gruit on YouTube, like I said before, there was this whole plethora of YouTubers that went out and tried to brew it, including myself. I mean, how was it on your end? Did you experience that as well?
Well, I had people that would send me messages, and they'd be like, "Hey, what did you use?" And can you contribute to the forums so that I could see some of your later iterations of brewing this thing? So I tried to keep both forums fairly up to date, insofar as some of the new recipes and new things that I try, and I try and do a Gruit every now and again. I'll probably do it again. I haven't been active on those forums for a while, but shortly after getting feedback from some people, some positive, some negative, I went to Portland last year and saw on the local liquor store shelf that New Belgium had tried making a Gruit.
That's right.
I was like, oh, I got to try this. There's an actual commercial brewery that tried this, and I wonder if my video had anything to do with that. Somebody professionally trying it, and I tasted their Gruit, and it was very similar to the way that mine tasted. And I thought that was pretty cool. That that I'd never had a commercial Gruit before, and I'd never had one ever, and nobody knew what it was supposed to taste like. And ultimately, a New Belgian brewery, they make Fat Tire and some other really good beers. They tried it, and I bought their beer and tasted it, and it was very similar to the one that I brewed. And I was like, oh, cool. Somebody else tried it and commercially produced it, and it does taste kind of similar to the one that I made. And that was pretty cool.
That's amazing. That's very, very cool. Moving away from a medieval brews that you've been into and that motivated a lot of people in order to create, you've also moved and motivated a lot of people to create these hot rock beers. Where did that originate from, and what is that all about?
Well, when I did the Gruit, I was inspired to search out and find something new, and try something that hadn't been done in a long time, and I didn't know what it was supposed to taste like or anything. Where the hot rock brew is kind of the opposite of that. I stumbled across the brewery, the local brewery in town does hot rock brews, and I'd seen a little bit on YouTube and whatnot, and know that it's kind of funny that people say, oh, you've gone to this advanced form of hot rock brewing, and it's like, well, in reality, it's the original form of brewing. Like, before they had boil kettles and whatnot, they were heating up rocks and throwing it in the water, and that's how they were getting water to boil. So,
and that's what they call Stein brew, right?
I don't know. I think so, but I don't know. But basically, I stumbled across hot rock brewing when the local brewery had a couple brews that they did that were hot rocks, and being that that's part of my social network, I was given a bunch of hot rock brews hot rocks to just play around with my next brew. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to use these things, and it's going to be awesome. I don't know when I'm going to use them or how I'm going to use them or when the opportunity will present itself that I should even try to brew a hot rock beer. But I stumbled across the style just because it's part of the local brewery, and I tasted some of those beers, and they were delicious. Just haven't. And I was like, oh, I want to try that. And see if I can do that myself.
Delicious how? How are they more delicious than anything else out there?
Well, it has sort of a residual sweetness that kind of rolls off the back of your tongue. Because the hot rocks, you basically heat the rocks up to the point where they're way, way above the boiling point. The water boils at 197 at my altitude, 212 at sea level, and when you throw a 600-degree rock or hotter into a brew kettle, there's a very small layer between the rock and the liquid that is superheated. And at superheated temperatures, sugar can caramelize. I think it's somewhere between 300 and 400 degrees, where you can actually caramelize sugars in the liquid versus just reducing the liquid and getting sort of a sweeter wort through reduction. And you actually create, I guess, more complex sugar strands when you caramelize the sugar that can't be broken down by the yeast. So it has a little bit of a residual sweetness on the back of your tongue when you finish drinking it is kind of the idea there. So I thought, I want to give that a try. How do I heat the rocks up, though?
Exactly. That's kind of like my next question. Like, how do you get the rocks so hot And then how do you actually deliver that into the boil kettle without destroying your face?
So originally, I had no idea how I was going to do it, and the local brewery uses like propane flamethrower torches kind of things, and that's not to say it's squirting a 10-foot flame out of the nozzle of the thing, but they have like this really long rod that shoots a flame that's probably that big, and they basically just wave this wand over all these rocks that they keep inside what essentially is a 5-gallon corny keg with holes cut in it.
Okay.
And they kind of like treat it very similarly to the way that you would put rocks on a barbecue. When you get the mass of the rocks hot and then the rocks stay hot and they do your cooking. They kind of do the same thing where they poke the flamethrower in and just kind of heat up the whole thing over the course of several hours. And then they dunk the corny keg into the boil kettle when they're adding the wort into it to do the boil step of the brew, and it hisses and spits and everything. And then when I got the rocks, I basically thought, well, I'll just throw them in my fireplace, because we had this big cast iron firebox kind of thing to keep the whole house warm. And I was able to get the rocks to be uniformly glowing red. I didn't actually show that particular part of the video, but in my first video that I tried it, you can see half the rock is literally glowing red.
I do remember that. Like, where did you get the rocks from?
It's just that one of the guys at the brewery, they had so many of them, he's like, here, take some. I was like, oh, okay, cool, I'll try that. So it was really donated by the local brewery to my learning how to become a better brewer.
What type of rocks? What type of rocks are they, and where can I find them?
They're basalt lava rocks. You can find them in or around volcanoes or maybe online. I live in near Mammoth, California, which Mammoth Mountain itself is a volcano that's completely separate from the super caldera that I live in. I live inside the Long Belly caldera, so for the 30 miles across the caldera is nothing but lava rocks everywhere. It doesn't. There's still trees and roots and grass and dirt and everything else that has grown since the 700,000 years ago when the thing erupted. But there's basalt rocks everywhere. So I actually just got them from where the brewery got them, which is from just kind of around town.
Oh, okay.
But I'm using basalt rocks. I understand that if you use granite has the ability of shattering. I'm not sure about marble. I know that you can have a marble stovetop with like a sterno burner underneath marble. So marble might work. Might be a little expensive, but marble might work. You could probably heat up some kind of metal. Maybe forge Excalibur in your next hot rod brew. Because metal won't shatter. But I think what you would be concerned with is rock that would shatter or fragment or cause little pieces of dirt and dust. And I understand that basalt style lava rock and maybe some Hawaiian lava rock maintains its heat very well, but can still go from hot to cold in the boil kettle and do that caramelization that you're looking for. So I don't know what other kinds of rocks could survive that extreme hot to almost cold when you put it into liquid.
Okay. I'm kind of curious, and I think I'm going to try an experiment where if I get the lava rocks that I'm supposed to put in my propane barbecue setup, like what do they call it? A Coleman or a...
okay, yeah. Like a Weber grill?
Exactly, like in a Weber grill, and just sort of see if those lava rocks would be useful.
Yeah, and I think the idea behind the hot rocks or the lava rocks is that the rocks will maintain heat for a very long time. And I think those are the rocks that you want, but you wouldn't want them to shatter when you throw them in a liquid. Right. So I don't think pumice would work very well. I think pumice is more of an insulator than it is something that would maintain heat because it's too light.
So is pumice the ones that you get for the Weber grills? I really don't know.
No, I don't think it is pumice. I was just commenting on I think pumice is the wrong type of rock to go for. I think you'd want to go with something that has some heft, a little bit of weight behind it. Because when I pick up my lava rocks, they're heavy. They're not like light rocks. They actually, you pick them up and you're like, oh, that's a heavy rock. So they're pretty dense, but they have that sort of porous surface at the same time.
Okay.
So
that's what's
I don't know. Give it a try. Put feedback on YouTube. We want to see it. This is the kind of stuff that we want to see.
Absolutely.
So,
speaking about YouTube, what do you think about the whole brewtubing community these days?
Well, when I started my channel, it was because I was looking for some parts to add to my, specifically a grain mill, to add to my brewing collection. And I started my channel quite on accident. I was just encountering some of the old timers that were not old timers. That's not the right word, but people that were making videos 5-6 years ago, like Craig Tube and Don Osborne and Bobby from New Jersey and some of those guys. And I happened across a video that in the old channel format, you used to have sort of a cross between a YouTube page and like a Facebook page where you could comment on the video or you could comment on the person's page. And I really like that format. I know that they changed it so that they could do the Google Plus thing, and that format kind of went to Google Plus. But I really like the old way that YouTube was. And you'll be used to be able to go to a channel and put a comment and say, hey, I like your channel, or your hair sucks, or whatever. And I stumbled across this argument of some guys kind of going at it about whether you could do all grain or extract, or it was kind of one of those type of arguments. And then everybody was chiming in their 2 cents. I was like, well, if everybody's going to argue about this, I've been brewing since 1994. YouTube's relatively new at the time that I just started using it as a source of knowledge rather than just to see cool car crashes or cute girls or whatever. And then I just said, well, I want to contribute what I've learned, and maybe it'll help somebody else down the line. And it kind of turned into hints and tips and tricks, and some random things that I've been doing in my life. That's kind of how it started. But the YouTube community has grown in I think a very positive direction, at least so far as brewtubers are concerned, because we're there to help each other out and try new things. And you got stuff like the Hokey Homebrew STA Pour Experiment, and other guys doing like, hey, I'm going to do this experiment with the different kinds of yeast to see which ones work better, or it's really become a cool source of knowledge. And occasionally get somebody like myself, it's like, well, I hear all these star sand myths. I'll devote a couple videos to, does star sand when it's cloudy get less effective over time? And so I think it's really cool because you can learn from other people's experimentation, and you can learn from other people's knowledge and mistakes, and you can make your own mistakes and other people can learn from that. I really like the way that the YouTubers have or the brewtubers specifically, have come together to help everybody out. And it's kind of cool to have like this virtual hand that's holding your hand, and everybody's sharing knowledge with everybody. And I myself have become a much more knowledgeable brewer simply because I'm exposed to everybody else and what their opinions and experiences are. I might not agree with all of them, but I'm exposed to it, and I can make up my own mind of whether that's valid or not. And I think that by its very nature is very helpful to anybody learning how to become a better brewer, a better whatever your craft is.
Absolutely.
I love that about YouTube. I think that's really cool.
You get to be able to take all of this input, filter it the way that you believe, balance it against your belief system, put it out there and apply it, or choose not to apply it. So you've got a lot of videos out there that have helped a lot of people take these experiments, take them up to the next level, and say, look, this is what I've learned, and apply this, or don't apply this, but I'm putting it out there because this is my experience. Do you have anything new that you want to share with the community going forward, or do you think that you've learned everything there is to learn?
No, I've never learned everything there is to learn. But I am going to get into, I wasn't planning on going down this road, but I am going to get into using different woods for flavoring. From experimenting with oak chips, for example, there's a path here. New stuff that I want to share, yes, and it's based on my oak chip experience. And what I've learned from oak chips is that if you use light oak or medium oak or dark oak, light oak is very easy and manageable to work with and imparts a lot of vanilla and coconutty tones. Medium oak chips, maybe a little bit more of an oaky flavor and less of the vanilla and coconut tones, the tones of the wood, shall we say. And the darker oak chips are very, very prevalent, very robusty, oaky, kind of that real in-your-face, almost that whiskey kind of oak tone.
Okay.
And I prefer using the lighter styles. I've used chips, I've used cubes, I've used spirals. I like the wood chips better than the cubes because they have a very high surface area. They're very easy to use. You use them once, you dump them out. You don't have to reuse them or clean them or store them or anything. And they impart a lot of oakiness. But taking that to the next step, I want to try stuff like mesquite or Palo Santo wood or koa or, like maybe a hickory. Everybody's always talking about making like a bacon beer. I don't want to make a bacon beer, but I think hickory would be kind of a neat flavor to have in a beer.
That's a very interesting sort of twist on that sort of.
Yeah. So why not try and do a beer with a little bit of a hickory wood? Because I think it would work just like oak wood. I know that oak was originally done because it has an antimicrobial property, and England could ship its IPAs on an oak cask that's overhopped. Between the oak and the hops, both being antimicrobial, you can survive a 7-month voyage to give beer to the troops.
Right.
Water it back down and to regular strength beer. People are like, we like it strong. Let's leave it strong in 7%. Funny thing, like I was telling this story to one of the people I was educating at the bar the other day, and he's like, "What do you mean they were supposed to water it down and turn it back to regular beer, from an IPA?" That was like the original intent. And I was like, "Yeah, see." So I grabbed the IPA from him, a little tasting glass, and I walked over to the sink and I filled it half up with water and half with the IPA, and I handed it back to him. He's like, "Oh, wow, it really is remarkably like regular strength beer," But I figured, why not try some of the other exotic woods that are out there that might be used in other things, not just beer. Why not try koa or hickory or mesquite or Palo Santo is something that I know is used in brews. I actually have 2 Palo Santo sticks with me right now. That's what it looks like. It smells like coconut.
Now, is that what Dogfish has as an entire a brew vessel for an entire secondary?
I don't know. I know that if you take the sticks and drop in the fermenter, it'll impart flavor. So do you even need to use a vessel, or why not just use your conical?
I think their entire vessel is made out of that type of wood. But let me go ahead and ask you, since you've tried all of these different flavors or variations of using oak in your beer, and you prefer the flaked oak chips rather than the cubes. How much do you use? Like if you got a 5-gallon batch, how much do you use?
I use about 4 ounces of volume, like 4 fluid ounces of volume. I have a tasting glass that on the side of the tasting glass it has a 4 ounce and a 2 ounce and like sort of ticks, so you know how much you're drinking in a tasting glass. But what I'll do is I'll take the light oak chips and I'll just stuff them inside this big shot glass, for lack of a better term. And I'll stuff them in like I'm trying to get as much ice into a glass as possible. And I filled the thing all the way up to 4 ounces for a 5-gallon batch. And then I'll pour a little bit of bourbon over the top of it just so that the bourbon soaks into the chips and sterilizes anything that might be there, and I let it soak for a day. And then I take that mass, which is mostly oak and very little bourbon, but just enough bourbon that the alcohol would kill anything because I'm paranoid, and I'll just dump that straight into the fermenter, and that gives me a very nice, subtle amount of oak without being overpowering when I use the lighter, the medium chips. If I use the dark chips to the same, about 4 fluid ounces of volume of oak chip, and I know that that's not really even accurate, like how do you weigh oak chips, But if you
4 ounces of volume.
Yeah, about 4 ounces, 4 fluid ounces of volume, like in like a shot glass, for example, or a tasting glass that I use, and then put a little bit of whiskey or scotch or bourbon on the top of that, and then throw it into the dark oak chips I think, produce a much more in-your-face prevalence of, an oakiness, more that smoky, oaky kind of heavy-duty flavor.
What about the time deltas? Because they say the longer you leave it in the beer, the more flavor it will impart. So
that's really true. And the reason that taking a step back, the reason that I don't use vodka and that I use actually bourbon or whiskey or scotch is those are all aged in oak barrels to begin with, So I figure I'm not hurting anything by putting an oaked alcohol on top of the oak chips. My sweet spot for the light oak chips is that after a couple days you can taste it, and after a month you can still taste it, but it's not overpowering. So the light and the medium oak chips, in my experience, they're good for 3 or 4 weeks, to kind of get a pretty good dose of the oak. Whereas the dark oak chips, after about a month, you get a really good oak flavor, in my opinion. And I know that the longer it stays in there, the more oakiness will come out of it. The local brewery that I get my beers from, they have an oaking program, or a barrel aging program is what they call it. They do most of their beers for about a year inside an oak, a 60-gallon, barrel.
Yep.
And that oak turns out to be pretty noticeable in the beers that you drink. Even if it's a darker style beer like a Russian Imperial Stout, you can still get the oak behind it. So since I do lighter styles, I think the oak comes through a little bit more than if I was to do like a stout or a porter or something like that.
So if you were to do a light beer and you put in medium toast French oak chips, you do about 4 ounces, just top it off with some bourbon just over the chips in this glass, let it set for a couple days, and then you put into the secondary, for example, and then you let it set there for anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks.
Yeah. And then it turns out fine. It has a nice, not overpowering oak tone. And if you want to get more of an oak tone, then just use more chips. I just, from my own personal sweet spot, I like it to be kind of subtle, but noticeable, but not like, oh, what's that? If I'm going for the, oh, what's that flavor? I can't put my finger on it. That's when I'm using stuff like mango powder or hibiscus or, some of the other herbs that you could throw in on top of a beer where people are like, ooh, that's good. What is that? You can't quite figure it out. Like a kaffir lime leaf, take a couple kaffir lime leaves and throw it on top of your IPA. Coronado Brewing Company is actually doing an IPA called Frog's Breath that they use kaffir lime leaves. And it's just a real subtle sort of citrusy tone that you're going to add on top of citrusy hops, and then you can't figure out what it is. And you just, like that's always kind of fun to do, is like throw in a little bit of something that's just going to throw somebody a little bit off. Like do an IPA and use like a half ounce of Carafa too to give it that little bit more of a darker color, but you can't quite figure it out. There's a lot of guys that are doing like IPAs and they'll use like chocolate malt or chocolate rye or black patent, which I find to be a little bit more in the bitter tones, personally. Whereas Carafa, I think, just adds more of a color rather than a flavor. So if I do like a black IPA myself, I'll build my black IPA recipe, and then I'll use a couple ounces of Carafa 2 or Carafa 3, which will really darken it up without causing the bitter, burnt tones in my IPA. I just want my IPA to be darker in color.
Yeah.
So.
What other tips and tricks would you like to share with the brewtubing community, sir?
Well, my favorite trick that I talk to new brewers all the time, which I think is a very significant learning experience. If you're going to learn how to brew, or if you already learned how to brew and want to be a better brewer, but not quite sure what you can do to significantly increase your effective brew, that's worded funny, but take a carboy, fill it full of water, stick the little thermometer, sticker thing on the side of the carboy, and go stick it where it's going to live, whether it's in a corner or your closet or wherever it's going to live when it's fermenting.
So we're talking like pre-brew.
Pre-brew, fill your carboy full of water, stick it where it's going to live when it's fermenting, and watch it. What is the temperature on that carboy? And let's just say, for sake of argument, that it comes out 70 degrees as the average temperature. in that location. Ideally, you want that location to be centrally located. It's not going to go hot and cold, have too many temperature fluctuations. Somewhere in the center of your house, someplace dark that's not going to get hit by sunlight. But, in an ideal world, let's just say that's a closet in the middle of the house and it's 70 degrees in there, or the water temperature itself is 70 degrees.
Yep.
Then the environment for which your yeast is going to be consuming its sugars, at about 70 degrees. Let's add a degree and call it 71 because yeast is exothermic and it gives off heat.
Which means, basically, when it's fermenting, it's going to be higher in temperature than what the ambient temperature around the fermenter is.
Correct.
Okay.
Or from what the water was at. So you brew your beer, you throw your yeast into it, and let's just guess that it's going to be somewhere around 71 degrees when it's doing active fermentation. This isn't an exact science. This is just trying to help out new people with, thinking about what their brew. So find out what your temperature is, add a degree to it, then go to your local homebrew supply stop, find a Y yeast or White Labs or, Danstar Fermentus, fermentation chart that says what the different strains of yeast are happy in the certain temperature ranges. Because you can go and say, okay, what are all the 10 different yeasts that are happy between 71 and 74 degrees? So then look at those yeasts and then cross-reference the style that those yeasts can brew very well, and pick the style of beer that you're going to brew based on the brewing environment that the fermentation is going to be taking place, rather than picking a beer and saying, I want to make a stout. I'll just make a stout and throw it in a closet and maybe it'll work. Don't do that. You'd want to do something that's like, if your closet's going to be at 70 degrees and you're going to try and make a certain style of beer, make the style of beer that works with the yeast that you're using, where the yeast is going to be happiest at 71 degrees, and your beer will turn out fantastic. Rather than trying to make an American lager when it's 85 degrees outside and you can't get your closet to be 45 degrees, your yeast is never going to be happy. So brew within your environment would be my number one suggestion to new and or existing brewers. If you're having trouble making good beers, look at how you're brewing your beer. Are you, is your yeast happy, and are you using the right yeast for the job for what you decided to brew? And is it a consistent temperature rather than fluctuating up and down throughout the day? I think that would be really important for a lot of people to know, because very few people seem to try that. I think a good analogy would be if you're going to build a skyscraper in Central America using polar bears, the polar bears aren't going to be happy in that really hot environment, and your skyscraper is going to come up, not being well built. And if you take a whole bunch of brown bears and try and build the skyscraper in Alaska or Antarctica or the North Pole, they're not really suited for that environment, and they're not going to make a very good skyscraper. But if you take the polar bears and try to build the skyscraper in Antarctica, then you have the right polar bears for the job. Not that polar bears are masters of craftsmanship, but you get what I mean. You're going to use the right polar bears for the job that they live in, that they're happiest, and then the only thing you have to figure out is how many polar bears do I need to make a skyscraper. And the same thing's true with yeast. If you take an ale yeast, you're not going to make a lager with the ale yeast. You're not going to make an ale with lager yeast, because the very nature of ale and lager yeast is some ferment well at 45 degrees, some ferment well at 75 degrees. So get the right yeast for the job and your beer will turn out fine. So
fantastic.
And just make sure you have a consistent temperature. If you have an area and you're trying to, I remember, this is another, I don't know if this is going to be helpful for somebody, but I remember brewing a beer once with Simcoe hops, and I don't particularly care for Simcoe hops. They have sort of a piney flavor that I don't care for. A lot of people say it's got sort of a catty flavor, but I think they detect pine and associate it with like a cat kind of a smell.
Cat piss.
But yeah, cat pee. And I brewed this beer with Simcoe, and I hated it. It was, it was like, I don't think I could salvage this thing. So actually, I pulled the keg from my kegerator. I had, at the time, I had something like 8 or 9 kegs and a 3-tap kegerator, and I just stuck it off in the corner and quite honestly forgot about it for 4 months. And I came back to it and tasted it, and it was wonderful. And the beer itself had aged in the keg. Now, what caused the beer to age in the keg? Because when I have my kegs, I'm very careful to make sure that they're filled with CO2 only and no oxygen, and I keep them stored under pressure under CO2, and there's no way there's oxygen in there because I purge 7-8 times before I store. And I noticed that the keg was in the corner of the room where the sunlight would cross every day, and the keg went hot and cold and hot and cold and hot and cold over the course of 4 months. And I think I literally forced the aging of the beer through the heat and cold cycles to get rid of some of that flavor, whatever that flavor was, that pine flavor that I didn't like about the Simcoe, and I tried it again, and it turned out great. So if you ever get a beer that you think it needs to be aged a little bit longer, and you have a kegged, environment, it might behoove you to try and put that keg and put it in the center of the room where the sunlight's going to cross every day for a little while, and see if you can't force age that keg into getting rid of whatever that flavor is that you don't like and age it a little bit. It won't be as strong, the hops won't be as prevalent, but something that you can try. I'd read that online at one point that cycling a beer to hot and cold or hot and cold, that's what kind of ages the beer. And it seems to be true from my experience. So that might be helpful to somebody.
I'd never heard that before. And
yeah, I think it'd be a neat experiment to do a double batch and have a keg in a cold location and have the other keg where it's going hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, just to see, what is the difference going to be after 2 months. That'd be a cool YouTube experiment. Like if SJ4 and Hooky Humber and all those guys want to do another experiment, maybe experimenting with what causes effective aging, or how long should something to be aged, or I remember back in the day with the Hooky Humber experiment and the SJ4 challenge, I thought it was really exciting to go from having a one set recipe and using a different kind of yeast was interesting, and one kind of recipe and using different hops, or using the same sort of thing and using a different malt was really cool in the insofar as that everybody could taste these beers and say, oh, that's what this tastes like, or that's what that tastes like, and no, here's the differences between the two. And I thought that was a little bit more interesting to me to watch than to have sort of like a contest to see who's the best brewer in the different continent or what have you. And I know there's a place for that as well. But I think what I would like to see, rather than just picking on one ingredient of, hey, what's the best hop, or what's the best grain, or what's the best malt, or what have you, why not design an experiment such that you can have 6 guys concentrate on the same exact recipe, and one of them can use Crystal 10 and Crystal 20 and Crystal 30 and 1680 and 120, and or maybe somebody can use melanoidin malt to sort of accomplish the same thing, so people would know the differences there. And then a second set of guys could do the same recipe and do a different hop, do Cascade, Crystal Saz, Fuggles, Centennial, Ruwaka, whatever. And then maybe have a third set of guys do the same sort of brew, and maybe all 3 batches could be very similar in character of base ingredients, but then have the last set of guys do like East Coast Ale versus Nottingham versus Burton versus SO5 and SO4, and the different yeasts that are out there. Mm-hmm. And then instead of trying to pick winner, everybody would get their own box of, okay, here's 6 beers that have, or 12 beers or whatever, that have the different kinds of hops. Now, here's the row of beers that's specific to the different crystals, melanoidins, and or the difference between chocolate malt and chocolate rye and black patent and, Carafa 1, 2, and 3, and so on and so forth. Maybe have another sleeve of beers that shows the differences with some of the very popular yeasts that are out there. Because I think as a home brewer, if I was to receive a box from the Hokey SJ experiment type of mentality, that I think it would be really cool to be able to go through a flight of beers with some of my friends and pick, the 6 beers that are about hops, when we're watching the football game tonight, to say, oh, this is really cool. I learned about hops tonight. And then the second part of the contest would be, or not the contest, but the second, the next time I drink the beers, I could concentrate on the differences and all the crystals and melanoidins and some of the grain differences and watch a hockey game. And then the third night, we could concentrate on the different yeasts. And the nice thing about breaking it up into small, manageable chunks like that isn't that you have to go through 30 beers all trying to figure out what the difference is and do a review and drink all these beers all at once. That's not doing anybody's beer justice, because you're in such a hurry to get through such a huge amount of beer to come up with a winner or do your review, or by the time you get halfway through it, you're sick of doing reviews and the quality has suffered right then and there anyway. Why not take it in little chunks and say, oh, here's 6 beers that has, the different kinds of hops, and then that's a manageable chunk, and you can watch a game and hang out with your friends. And then the next time you want to do your video review to put feedback on the YouTube community, you can take it in small chunks and nobody's suffering because they're at the front or the end of the line, or you're sick of doing reviews, or, you're just sick of drinking the same beer with different hops or whatever. You're like, why not treat it like I'd like to get that box of beer in the mail that has a little bit different kind of, like one for hops, one for grains, one for, just a little bit of a different kind of a learning experiment that would be manageable and could be taken in small chunks. And I wouldn't just learn about, they wouldn't spend a whole season learning about one hop. You kind of cover 3 different categories in the same experiment, so to speak. I think that would be really cool to really drive forward the YouTube brewing community as a learning experience, and everybody learning how to lift one another up. I think that's where I'd like to see the experiments go, is and maybe in that kind of a direction.
It's a very enlightening and insightful feedback. Bring it back to its roots.
Well, it's not even about the roots. It's just about, like, if I'm going to put in time and money and shipping and organizing, selfishly, I don't want to go through, 20, and I haven't participated as of yet, but I wouldn't want to go through 20 beers and having, one beer be the winner just simply because it was when it was new and fresh, and 18 beers later, I'm sick of doing this, video review.
I know what you mean.
And I think it's, if you can take it in little tiny chunks, it would be better for everybody. And I want to learn something. When beers come in the mail, I don't want them just to be beers to drink. I want them to be beers like, oh, this is brewed by so and so, and he decided to showcase this, and I want to learn about this. That's what I want in beer mail, I guess. So
I think that's a very interesting idea. Is that what we can expect for the Immo 2015 challenge?
Yeah, really. I don't know that I'll be doing the Immo 2015 challenge, but I would certainly like to, be a bigger part of the community. I've kind of come and gone through the past 5 or 6 years, and now I'm starting another leg of, actively, working on my channel, and I think we're going to see some, like the things that I want to do this year is I want to work on, maybe developing and designing a hybrid system of like a Herms Rims thing, kind of like what Tom Roeder and a hockey player and Maine Brew guy did with their respective setups. Yep. I just want mine to run on propane and electricity. I would like to experiment more with wood and oak aging and barrel aging, and the differences between light, medium, and dark oak I've already kind of discovered, and there's some nuances there. And I would also like to try things like hickory or mesquite or palo santo or koa, or why not even coconut, or the other kind of woods that are out there. Maybe try and put some palm branch in and see what kind of flavor character that might have, added to the beer. And although I might be crazy that people like Mr. Yates here might try bacon beers, but you know what? I've never tried a bacon beer, so I can't really say you shouldn't do that. If you think you can figure out a way of brewing something, by all means, try it. Make a bacon beer with hickory. That might be fantastic. But, what I don't like about the BJCP type of guidelines is that they say that you can't brew a beer because a certain beer can only brew beer in a very specific and certain way with certain grains, and then you get people that say, "Oh, I'm a BJCP judge," and you can't do that. And they try and find something wrong with the beer rather than try and find something that's right with the beer. When the big obvious thing that's staring everybody in their face is that, how did we get to 200 and 500 or 1,000 different styles of any alcoholic beverage, whether it's wine, beer, or hard alcohol, or vodka or whiskey? Just the fact that there's all those different things out there means that it can be done a different way. So why limit yourself to only brewing one specific kind of way? That's only hurting you. And we would never have gotten to 500 different styles of beers had somebody not tried something new at one point. And that's what I think YouTube is about, is sharing our experience so we can all learn from our mistakes or say, oh, hey, I've got an idea. That's a great idea, but what if we did this? That's kind of what keeps the creative juices flowing. And again, I know I said this a couple times, but that's what I love and embrace about the YouTube, brewtubing community is we're all kind of holding each other's hands and charging forward blindly like lemmings toward a giant chocolate cake that is mysteriously hidden in the sky, but we're going to find it one day, and it's just going to be in the form of a really good beer that somebody hasn't brewed yet.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Immo, for joining me for this in the Brewhouse session. You are an inspiration to many, and I can't wait to be able to talk with you again and see how things are going in the future. So thanks a lot for joining me.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, and maybe we can all just get together one day and have a Skype beer session. We all have a couple beers together and hang out and share our knowledge. I'd like to see more of that in our community as well.
That's great. So. Fantastic. Thanks a lot, man. Cheers.
All right. Cheers.